The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. I don't think this one needs any sort of introduction. It is probably the all-round most critically acclaimed game ever released. A true classic with significant impact on the industry back in 1998, and a title of which the influence is still seen and felt today in modern gaming. On top of that, it was a massive commercial success, outperforming any Hollywood film at the time in terms of generated revenue. That right there speaks volumes on how hyped and popular Ocarina of Time was. I first got my hands on the game via a special edition of the Wind Waker for the GameCube in 2002 or 2003, which included a bonus disc containing the original Ocarina of Time and the Hardeman Master Quest variant. If memory serves me right, Ocarina of Time was the first Zelda game I had ever played and also beaten. I think I touched and completed Wind Waker later and would then go on to explore the franchise further. So yeah, I'll come out and say it straight away. Ocarina of Time is probably the most nostalgic game ever for me, alongside Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Sonic Adventure 2 and Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. And I must have gone through it at least 10 times in my life. Still, it's now over 12 years after my initial experiences with it as a kid, and for the sake of delivering a fair review/analysis, I have to put my personal feelings aside as much as I possibly can. The ultimate question here is, do I feel Ocarina of Time deserves all the praise and recognition it has been receiving for almost 2 decades now? And additionally, how well has it kept up with the never-ending development of the gaming industry? The Legend of Zelda games have practically always been of the adventure type, mixed with sprinkles of RPG elements, where players fight a wide array of enemies and bosses, explore big landscapes, discover hidden places, solve various puzzles in dungeons, and complete optional side quests. Ocarina of Time is no different, but what makes it important and special is the fact it was the first 3D Zelda title. All the elements that made 2D Zelda games feel like Zelda suddenly had to be carried over to a 3-dimensional environment. That said, what better way to kick things off than by talking about Link himself and the way he controls in a 3D environment. One of the great advantages of the N64's analog stick over the SNES its D-pad is the greater sense of control over a character's movement, speed, and direction, and it's no different for Link, which is a neat feature but not unique to Zelda in any way. What is unique though is that you cannot jump at any given moment with the button press. You need to guide Link to the edge of a platform with decent momentum for him to automatically hop off. If he approaches the ledge too slowly, he will instead grab onto it as to not fall off instantly. This was probably done to keep some of the feel intact from the 8-bit and 16-bit overhead installments, but it's counterintuitive to newcomers to 3D Zelda. We've been conditioned by so many games not to walk off edges and ledges. After this initial hurdle, it should become second nature in no time, but it's worth noting. The next thing is context-sensitive actions, performed by pressing the A button, which, as the name suggests, has Link performing the action indicated by the UI. Think of pushing blocks, talking to people, opening doors or chests, grabbing pots or bombs, letting go of vines, things of that nature. Again, the Zelda series didn't invent this, but it's a welcome mechanic because it gives developers more buttons to work with for other commands and functions, such as the shield having its own dedicated button now, the R button to be precise. In A Link to the Past, the shield protects Link when it's positioned in front of him correctly and he isn't using another item in the meantime. In Ocarina of Time, the shield can be held up manually at any time to defend yourself against attacks or bouncing incoming projectiles back. Personally, I really like that, as you feel more in control over when and how you use your shield, adding depth to the game's combat with extra elements of timing and anticipation. Of course, when one wields the shield, he also wields a sword. There are a number of different ways Link can attack with it, from slashing normally by simply pressing the B button and holding the desired direction on the analog stick, to a spin maneuver which is activated by holding and releasing the B button. Things get a bit more complex when the Z Z-trigger gets thrown into the mix, which puts Link in his strafing mode. Besides the typical advantages of keeping the focus in front of you while moving Link himself around in any direction, this strafing also allows him to pull off jump slashes that deal twice the damage but are trickier to land the hit with, and side hops and backflips to swiftly dodge incoming attacks. The reason I say it is somewhat complex though is because the Z-trigger reacts differently depending on the situation. When specific objects, most notably enemies, are in Link's direct sight, the Z-trigger activates Z-targeting, a system that forces the camera to follow whatever you've targeted onto and will automatically have Link facing in that direction as well. This was quite revolutionary and important. In 2D overhead Zelda, you can oversee the entire screen at all times, but in 3D, such luxury is simply an impossibility. By having the camera focusing on and following an enemy, players can keep a clear eye on it, minimizing the frustration of not knowing where to look or what's going on. For the majority of the game's one-on-one battles, it does its job remarkably well. So well that there is barely anything to bitch about. It's just when the opposition existed of a group of moving enemies, fights had a tendency to seem somewhat messy and clustered because it's not exactly easy to control what or who you're going to lock onto, leading you to getting ambushed in ways that don't feel wholly of your own fault. Accentuating the issue is that targets also have to be pretty close to the center of the screen for Z-targeting to activate properly, because there were instances I tried locking onto a bad guy that was clearly in my vision, but jack shit happened as it was too far off into a corner or something. It can be notably problematic and grating with tiny enemies such as bats that fly up and down and all around throughout entire rooms, especially because you don't always have an idea where they're at. But even though Z-targeting isn't quite flawless in situations like this, to me it's never been rough to the point that I found combat to be intolerable. The camera in general is very solid for a 1998 game. Ocarina of Time allows you to center the camera behind Link with a quick press on the Z-trigger, which may seem of minor significance but is an absolute godsend. And little touches such as the camera panning down whenever you're standing at an edge can help a long way. Perhaps most important is the broadness of the settings and level design, leaving little room for the camera to get jammed or obstructed, and most of the time when a fixed angle is in order, the game will use one. You can also enter first person mode when stationary, which allows you to get a better idea of your surroundings as well as aim items better. Movement felt very stiff to me unfortunately, but maybe that's because the analog sticks on the GameCube and classic controllers lack the precision of the Nintendo 64's. Your guess is as good as mine. Now, besides the discussed imperfections of Z-targeting, there are those times the camera kinda falls apart in the occasional tight and cramped areas. Immediately springing to mind is Gerudo's Fortress, where you gotta sneak past guards in narrow hallways filled with boxes and other junk, hindering your oh so needed view. I constantly found myself attempting to look around corners and such in an attempt to observe the guards, but too often I would come to the sad conclusion that I missed information and got caught as a result. Damn, these ladies ain't kidding around. The game does also have its moments of failing to beware the players of threats around them, effectively blindsiding them, and that is never good design. Yet, even with all that in mind, I have to praise Ocarina of Time for its camera. It's never had serious consequences for my enjoyment of the game, which is more than I can say for the Italian plumbers jump into 3D, and achieving that in your transition from 2D to 3D is no small feat. By having a well-behaving camera that doesn't need much control on the player's end, the yellow face buttons, basically equivalent to a second analog stick, could instead be used in Ocarina of Time to assign items to. 3 if you want an exact number, the 4th one being reserved for entering first person mode. See how many items you can get in total? It would be a continuous pace breaker if you only had one button to map items to. With the multiple button setup, say I have the hookshot and fairy bow equipped, I can instantly swap between them with the press of a button. It's efficient and very effective for maintaining the game's flow. Unfortunately, I still did find myself opening up the inventory screen more than I would have liked. And what perplexes me a bit is that the D-pad isn't used for more item slots. The D-pad doesn't serve much of a purpose as it is, so what's the deal with that, Nintendo? It's not like I'm really complaining here. 3 items mapped simultaneously is already a big step to reducing time spent in menus, but I genuinely feel this already great system could have been even greater. Think about it. For items like the Ocarina and bottles, which are often used under peaceful circumstances at a standstill, would it be such a struggle to move your hand on the controller? I don't believe so. But this isn't so much of a big deal. By far the worst of the item management is the handling of, take a wild fucking guess, boots. Y'all know what I'm referring to specifically, those cursed iron boots. These abominations cannot be equipped via a C button. Rather, they have to be manually selected by pausing the game and clicking on them. You use these boots to sink to the bottom of areas filled with water, but every single time you want to return to the surface, you have to take them off again. Places like the water temple constantly demand you to go deep and get out of the water back to back. And another example that really drives the issue home is this room in the Gerudo training ground, where you have to collect all the silver rupees in a pool of water with moving currents. Since Link isn't capable of actually swimming up and down at will, you have to rely on the iron boots to manipulate your positioning in the water. But every time you put these things on, you lose complete control over yourself until you land on the bottom. I get the logical argument behind the C buttons. They are for toys Link holds in his hands, but come on. Working with the iron boots is incredibly and needlessly aggravating and hella tedious. The hover boots also suffer from the same fate, but at no point in the game do you need to equip and unequip them so flippin' often, making them far less offending. Important to note is that the 3DS version of the game fixes the boots issue by having them act as C items, which is a vast improvement and how the original N64 classic ought to have done it in the first place. It certainly wasn't rocket science, guys. Anyway, as for all the items and upgrades and spells themselves, Ocarina of Time contains loads of them to be found, some being optional, some being mandatory. Either way, they're divided into 2 categories, as I said. Link's body equipment, which includes swords, shields, tunics, and boots, as well as upgradable bomb bags, arrow quivers, and rupee wallets, for example. And the C items Link holds in his hands, which can range from a boomerang to a hammer, and a lens that allows you to expose false elements to various magic spells. Both categories complement each other well and bring different features to the table. Ignoring the fact the boots should not have been in the former category, the equipment upgrades are neat because they don't ask the player to swap stuff around, or at most very little. They're more elements of growing stronger, RPG-like in a sense. The mirror shield, for instance, has the capability to reflect light needed to solve puzzles, but holding onto it poses no downsides. Everything the Hylian shield can do, the mirror shield can do. And the same goes for the ability to hold more ammo and supplies. The many C items, however, have more diverse and unique properties. You actively use them. What I enjoy about most Zelda items is that they can be put to use in combat situations as well as puzzle solving, all in different ways. Deku sticks can be used to deliver painful slashes, but also to light torches, and bombs can be used to catch enemies in the blast radius, but also to blow up set pieces for secrets. Heck, even bottles, primarily used to carry potions and whatnot, can be used to return some projectiles. The only noteworthy concern I have is the limited use of a selection of these items. Take the ice arrows, which freeze enemies upon impact, but is never used for puzzle solving whatsoever. It's nice that they deal more damage, I suppose, but the incentive to try them out was never big enough to justify opening the menu and swapping around, because the sword and other items already fulfill my combat needs. The Megaton hammer is perhaps even worse. It can pack a punch when it connects, but it is too short range and slug sluggish to be practical in most battles, and its use is also mandatory for progression and discovering secrets. See, this hammer is needed so infrequently and in such shallow ways that it just comes across as a way for the developers to control where you can go at any given moment and to ensure you're not sequence breaking. But that's not really a good justification for bringing in a whole new weapon. In many scenarios, it's merely used to slam rusty switches into the ground, so just another means of opening doors. What does the application of the hammer in this case truly add to the gameplay? Usually, I want to replace the damn thing with another item on my C buttons as quickly as possible afterwards. Contrast that to something like the hook shot, which can be used to stun bad guys, reel in certain faraway objects, but also to pull yourself up towards higher ground or distant areas. It's so much more helpful on a regular basis, and thus you won't feel like you're wasting a C slot on it. Fortunately, on the whole, I think there's not much else wrong with Link's arsenal. It is pretty comparable to that of A Link to the Past in terms of what you get, but for a Zelda game, I think that's fitting and there's just enough new. I especially like the versatility of the ocarina itself. Having an instrument that's not only an integral part of the game's plot, but one you can change the time of day with and the weather with, to warp around Hyrule with, and to solve quote-unquote puzzles with, more on that later, is pretty neat. That covers about everything related to controls, mechanics, and the stuff Link is capable of. How about that actual adventure itself? I guess we'll start off with the main quest. You can typically divide this into two parts for every Zelda title: the series of tasks that pave the way to the new dungeons, and then those dungeons themselves. Obviously, outside dungeons is where all the traveling and exploring happens, on the big land of Hyrule and its handful of towns and villages. A lot of your time will be spent going from place to place, taking on various enemies in combat, obstacle course type challenges along the way, and talking to NPCs. Now, I'll be the first to admit that meeting and interacting with people as executed in Ocarina of Time kind of feels like filler to me personally in video games. A good example here is getting King Zora's flabby butt cheeks out of the way to reach the third dungeon, Jabu Jabu. To get him to move, you need to find a bottle with a letter from Princess Ruto in it. In order to get that bottle, you have to beat a really easy diving minigame to obtain the silver scale. I'm not really a fan of these portions, simply because they're a bit boring to me, but I can imagine what will be others' arguments for these snippets of gameplay. For one, it adds to the world building, establishing connections with the people from Hyrule. It contains multiple races such as the Gorons and the Gerudos, which gives each corner of the world its own unique vibe, and lines of text are rarely recycled between people. This can make interacting with these characters pretty enjoyable and worthwhile. It shapes a breathing world that one can find themselves lost in, purely to relax and see what's out there. If that's totally up your alley, then I don't think you'll see these walk and talk sections as big concerns. In fact, you'll probably dig them. But I'm with Ego Raptor on this in saying that having the player's progression halted by mundane tasks doesn't really work in the game's favor for me. That's not to say the developers clearly didn't do that for a reason. Jealous fuckface in Kokiri Forest won't let you visit the Great Deku Tree unless you get a sword and shield. Things like this were put in to guarantee people weren't, again, sequence breaking or reaching newer, harder parts earlier than intended. They act as progression limiters and gates. I have the same sneaking suspicion for King Zora and being forced to show the letter from the bottle you dive up, which is to ensure players have at least one bottle for when owning one is mandatory later on in the main quest. This, forcing the player on a path design philosophy, is just something Nintendo has taken on for a lot of Zelda titles since the release of Ocarina of Time, and I'm not the one to judge whether they should have or not. The linearity versus non-linearity debate is very much subjective, and there is room for both in video games as a medium. Criticizing one or the other as objectively wrong isn't really possible, and neither should you want to do that. That said, given that Ocarina of Time's main quest tries for a more linear adventure with a great amount of direction given to the player, I shall bring up my issue with the fire arrows then. After finishing the water temple, you can obtain these by shooting a regular arrow into the rising sun at morning at a specific spot. There's a stone that hints at this process, but it doesn't really catch your attention that much. Here's the kicker. In no part during the adventure do you need the fire arrows except for one single room in Ganon's castle near the end of the game. As far as I'm concerned, the fire arrow should have been optional in the first place, considering how you obtain them, in this weird, non-obvious fashion. For the rest of the mandatory items, the game tries its damnedest to guarantee you'll get them. However, to have the fire arrows be a requirement for one damn room far later on in your journey is taking the piss. Who is going to be linking this ordinary small stone hours back to this one-off spider web in the ceiling? Can you imagine how fucking clueless you would be without a guide? It feels very poorly thought out. Entering the third dungeon, Jabu Jabu's Belly, is another prime example of stupid crypticism. When you arrive at the dude's chilling spot, his mouth is shut and he won't open it. The sign before him reads, "Don't disturb Lord Jabu Jabu." So, you try shooting bullets up his nose to make him mad, putting down a bomb to blow his lips off, all to no avail. Turns out you are supposed to catch a fish in a bottle a bit further back in Zora's domain and drop it in front of Jabu Jabu. How am I supposed to figure that out? And what purpose does this task serve? It almost feels as if the developers put that in purely because they thought it would be funny or some shit, but I can imagine it's super annoying if you haven't got a monkey's what to do. See, over the walking and talking, I much prefer the more stealth and action-oriented objectives, which can range from sneaking around castle guards to safely reach Princess Zelda without getting spotted, to racing a dead man to the finish deep underneath the catacombs. My reasoning is simply that they are more challenging and captivating. You can actually fail at them, if you get what I mean, and your abilities are tested and trained in a way that's applicable for dungeons and general game challenges as well. The best example is the Gerudo's Fortress portion of the game, where the player has to find 4 imprisoned men in order to reach the nearby desert. Camera jank aside, I actually enjoyed this process because I had to figure out where each of them were located while simultaneously not trying to get caught, and there were also battle scenarios involved. On top of that, you've got a compelling narrative, namely freeing innocent people from their respective cells. It's worth noting that walking and talking is mostly a part of young Link's portion of the game though. As adult Link, you're usually going straight from dungeon to dungeon with little in the way of character interaction. As such, adult Link's part of the game is easily the least obstructive of the two, and therefore also the best and most enjoyable, if you ask me. That said, I think the contrast in progression and gameplay might have been set up to enhance the power of Ocarina of Time's narrative, but I'm not entirely sure on that. Let me elaborate. The game's story revolves around the young boy Link meeting the Princess of Hyrule, Zelda, on a mission to prevent Ganondorf from reaching the Triforce located in the Secret Realm, a place that can only be accessed with the help of the Ocarina of Time and the 3 spiritual stones. Oftentimes, young Link is not taken seriously by guards or other civilians of Hyrule on this mission. He couldn't possibly achieve great things, he's but a kid. Then, as adult Link, no longer are folks in his way. He's no longer being picked on or mocked. He's become the legendary hero of time, out to free the sages of Hyrule and participate in the decisive battle with the evil Gerudo King. As many others have pointed out, there is a strong emotional aspect to this growth element of Ocarina of Time. In fact, I may argue that this detail alone is why the story and events of the game have resonated with so many players. The plot at its fundamentals isn't any different from A Link to the Past or many games from the time. The protagonist is on an adventure to save the world from the ill-willing antagonist. Many of the characters you run into for the main quest also aren't particularly engrossing. Most of them are relevant once or twice and then largely forgotten about. The only exception for me is Ganondorf himself, which might just be a very personal thing of mine, but as a kid I've always found him to be scary and intimidating in the few encounters you do have with him. I thought the mysteriousness and darkness to him was pulled off very well, but ignoring Ganondorf, it's essentially the time traveling gimmick of the whole narrative that I think stands out and elevates Ocarina of Time above A Link to the Past in terms of storytelling. From a gameplay execution standpoint, however, I wish you didn't have to warp to the Temple of Time and pull out or put back the Master Sword every time you want to travel through time. In A Link to the Past, you could switch on the fly, but that's not the case here. Fortunately, you only need to go back and forth for the main quest 2 times, so it's pretty harmless in the case of that. But if you're the type of person that likes to invest in side quests or 100% completion as well, you will understand just how annoying this can become. In A Link to the Past, the light and dark world are also substantially different in terms of both appearance and stuff to do. In Ocarina of Time, the majority of Hyrule is completely unaffected after these 7 long years of despair, with the notable exceptions of the town market and Zora's Domain, and merely a few side quests changed between young Link and adult Link. It's a bit underwhelming, to be sincere. Not only for the aforementioned world building, but 2 different overworlds could have formed an interesting ingredient for more intricate field design as well as dungeon design, and I think it's a shame the developers either failed to or didn't care to capitalize on that. Sadly, the overworld of the game is about as flat as Miley Cyrus's ass in general. Hyrule Field is huge, yet contains very little marks of interest. There's Lon Lon Ranch in the middle and 6 areas circling around it. In between, there's literally empty land with some grass and trees. If you're lucky, you'll discover a couple of secret holes, but besides the very rare piece of heart you can find, they're practically useless wastes of time. Back in the day, I think this ginormous field could have given players such a sense of epicness and freedom that the poor ratio of actual worthwhile content to the scale of the world was easily overlooked and forgiven. Nowadays, the graphics aren't impressive anymore, neither the scope, so Hyrule Field can be a chore to traverse for newcomers as well as on repeat playthroughs for veterans, especially considering Link's abysmal walking speed. The decision to not make the overworld more condensed, while arguably right for 1998, is a decision that has caused it to not withstand the test of time in my eyes. It is only fair to say though that you hardly spend time here for the main quest, because you're generally going straight from point A to point B with rarely any backtracking. As adult Link, you also learn songs from Sheik that allow you to warp to various places across the map. It's often speculated as well that Hyrule Field was made so massive to have the player desire a method to traverse it more efficiently, as shown at the title screen with the horse Epona. This wish would then later be granted through a small side quest. That doesn't take away the overworld is uninteresting and an empty void no matter how you shake it, but do whatever you want with that. So, I know I would logically get into the dungeons now, since I said I was discussing the main quest first, but screw it, I think we've got a better segue into side quests here than dungeons, so let's just roll with that. Anyway, the side quests are the most hit or miss parts of the game for me personally. I'll start with the ones I don't really care for, the first of which being the item trading sequences, because these are fetch quests of the highest degree. You start both quests by meeting certain personas who give you an item. From there on out, it's on you to trade these items with the right people, and while sometimes you're given direction or a tip of sorts on whom to trade the current item with, other times you're left clueless and pretty much expected to talk to random folks all over the world to proceed with the quest. If you know me, I see very little entertainment value in blindly messing about in the hope to achieve something, and fetch quests in general aren't much of my cup of tea. I mean, I guess you meet some cool personas and everything, so it slightly helps immersing me into the world more and connecting with the NPCs in it, but I do wish the process itself of reaching them isn't as dull and repetitive as it is in Ocarina of Time. Every now and then, there's a time limit thrown into the mix, which is both a blessing and curse simultaneously. The former because it spices up the job and puts healthy pressure on the player, and the latter because you have to travel all the way back to your initial starting point in order to have another crack at this speedrun thing. The big Po Hunt is something else I never look forward to. It requires you to to find, defeat, and catch the 10 different big Poes scattered across Hyrule Field on horseback and return them to this freak located at the Hyrule Castle town. This is basically a scavenger hunt without any guidance. The big Poes are all found at fixed sections of the overworld, and once they reveal themselves, you have to land 2 arrows on them to catch them. I shall stress that others may well see something in these type of missions that I do not, but to be frank, I myself only ever take them on for the reward. While that in and of itself is often enough of a motivation for me to go through them, I think we can all agree you ideally want to have a good time in the meantime too. Hyrule Field definitely adds insult to injury here because unlike the main quest, many of the side quests demand frequent back and forth traveling and backtracking. To be honest though, there are more side quests that I enjoy than ones I do not enjoy. There are 2 very predominant ones, namely the heart pieces as present in pretty much any Zelda game and the gold sculptulas, unique to Ocarina of Time. Collecting 4 heart pieces grants Link 1 additional hearts, as do heart containers dungeon bosses leave behind by the way, which indicate his health and how much damage he can take. This is always a lovely side quest because there are so many varied tasks to get a hold of these things. You may find one after discovering an obscure cave on Hyrule Field, solving a mini puzzle somewhere, clearing an obstacle course properly. The works. As for the gold sculptulas, there's a grand total of 100 of them to be collected in the game, and whenever one is in your direct environment, they'll start making noises. What makes them stand out and special is that audio plays the biggest role in finding them, which is something I really appreciate and dig because sound usually isn't utilized that effectively in video games. These 2 are probably my favorite side quests in the game because they form an interesting dynamic with the other ones. Most of them need to be fully completed before you'll get your reward, but with heart pieces and gold sculptulas, you'll be reaping the benefits as you go. With the former, your health is increased bit by bit, and with the latter, you'll be getting multiple goodies as you possess more and more gold sculptulas. They're also the least intrusive to the main quest, seeing how they kind of intertwine together in dungeons and anywhere you go really. The other side quests are more separated, and that's not necessarily a negative at all because they offer the player opportunities to detach themselves from the more linear main quest should they desire. Variety is the spice of life. Besides the item trading sequences and the big Poe hunt, think of minigames to be played for various prizes. Shooting galleries, going out fishing, testing your luck in a gambling streak, or casually playing some tunes with kits and frogs. Not all of them are terribly interesting, but they form a relaxing change of pace and they can make for some good practicing to get more familiar with the controls or the uses and applications of certain items. Fully completing the horseback archery range is the most maddening crap I've had to suck up though. The inaccurate aiming in first-person view really rears its ugly head when you're on a moving horse and have to hit incredibly small spots consistently to win. Now, Epona's unlocked through a minigame as well, where you have to beat the ranch owner Ingo in 2 consecutive races. I always get a kick out of these, not because they're deep or hard or anything, but because I love blocking this cheating douchebag whenever I can for some reason. That said, Epona is a pretty good reward as she makes traveling that bit more bearable, as pointed out earlier. I hate how she comes to a dead stop whenever she approaches the slightest of angles or edges though. It's really irritating when it happens, but I'm glad she's there to lessen the pain that is Hyrule Field. I would say the last side quest worth mentioning is the Gerudo Training Ground. In a sense, you could call it an optional dungeon that mixes together various elements and challenges from everything you faced in the entire game. It's a nifty little place to explore if you love yourself them Ocarina of Time dungeons though. Don't expect to be blown away by the treasure waiting inside. This is the opposite case of the fetch quest and the big Poe hunt. I enjoy the task itself, I just don't care for the reward. That's still not ideal, but I will always take that over what I consider shitty tasks with good rewards. On the topic of dungeons, I think it's about time we finally get to those. In short, Zelda dungeons are collections of puzzles, obstacle courses, and combat scenarios that reward you with keys and new items mandatory to dig deeper and deeper into said dungeon, where you ultimately face off against the big boss and then receive the quest-related medals, stone, or whatever other fancy mug. Any Zelda fanatic can tell you that puzzle elements are probably the most central feature of the ones I mentioned, and here's the thing about them with Ocarina of Time. A good chunk of them are based around awareness of the three-dimensional environment. Not completely unexpected, since this is the first Zelda in 3D. Whether it's shooting eyeballs in the walls, lighting all the torches in a room, or setting up a linear chain of mirrors to reflect light, the solution boils down to looking around and getting the full picture of the room for quite a bit of these. Of course, there are more actual puzzles as well, where you need to realize a proper solution. From an eyeball on the wall frozen in ice with a torch in the center of the room, to a sliding ice block you gotta push in a certain pattern to reach the next room. But they're not that common. I do wish the dungeons contained more of these actual puzzle types. Anybody with a decent amount of Zelda experience won't really have to try hard with the others. However, for the first title in 3D, these dungeons aren't too shabby. Most of them contain a good flow, meaning you're able to smoothly progress further into the dungeon without getting stuck for an extended period of time, because the majority of these places are structured in a pretty straightforward fashion, where you can go from room to room without severely problematic backtracking. We also ought not to forget that Zelda has always been designed with children in mind as well, so deep and complex puzzles would probably make him rage quit and put the game down. Even so, the dungeons aren't a complete cakewalk, mind you. There is enough challenge here for newcomers, and they still manage to be the highlight of Ocarina of Time for me as well. That's in part due to those more obstacle course type challenges the dungeons sometimes throw at you, as I've brought up. Most commonly, they revolve around collecting all the silver rupees in a room with dangerous hazards and enemies around to get in your way. And every now and then, these sections almost feel executed like a platformer, especially in the very last dungeon. This honestly forms a great change of pace from the puzzle solving and combat, and is interesting for gameplay variety reasons. If you want to hear about my personal favorite dungeon, the water temple would likely be it. I'll go hide in a corner now. Many people hate this infamous dungeon, in part due to the iron boots, but I found it to be the most satisfying dungeon from a design standpoint. I say this because it has a central mechanic, namely 3 different water levels that influence the rooms you can enter and the stuff you can accomplish in them. Even though tedious backtracking is an inevitable downside to such a layout, I appreciate the water temple purely for the fact that it totally requires more processing on the player's end to put all the pieces together. You most likely will run into multiple dead ends here with seemingly no other options on your first visit, but those moments you finally figure out where to go and what to do, man, they're probably some of the most joyous one could have in Ocarina of Time. Ironically, my least favorite dungeon in the game is the bottom of the well, which I'm not even sure if it's officially considered a dungeon or not, but it's my review, so I'll have it my way. In here, you find the Lens of Truth, which exposes the real state of environments in the game. However, this place is filled to the brim with traps, pieces of what seemed like solid ground that you fall right through. I understand that the designers wanted to make me feel unsettled in here and then relieved once finding the item that reveals the traps. I get that, but when I plunder to the bottom floor over and over because I am hardly able to predict where I could walk or not, and have to travel back to this singular ladder and climb up all the way again and again, I feel more angry than uncomfortable. Seriously, this part of the game is obnoxious, and I feel it could have been better had all the traps been placed with proper logic and hints behind them. As for the Master Quest variation of Ocarina of Time that came packed in with the GameCube bonus disc, the only only aspect of the whole game that's tinkered around with are the dungeons. The story, the overworld, the side quests, the bosses, and all that other jazz completely left identical. So, the dungeons are mainly redesigned to be harder, and such is largely achieved through amplifying the concept of 3D awareness. Important objects can be placed in the most obscure locations, be they far away or high up. Occasionally, I ran across quite some great puzzles as well though. In the Spirit Temple, there is this small hole you cannot crawl through because a stone is blocking the pass through, so you let through a bomb tube to clear up. Then there's this one room in the Shadow Temple where you gotta collect all the silver rupees with the most awesome solution for one of them, as you have to let yourself get sucked up by a like who proceeds to spit you out into an otherwise unreachable rupee. I think puzzles where you have to put various pieces together rather than collecting all the information from the room are more prominent in Master Quest, which I like. However, I feel Master Quest on the whole lacks a bit of the flow and intuitiveness of the original dungeon designs. For example, in the Fire Temple, you are supposed to find a breakable wall by slashing away at every inch of the room with your sword, since breakable walls trigger a different impact sound according to the imprisoned Gorons. I got stuck here for a good 30 minutes or so, and finding the way to progression felt more tedious than anything else to me. Master Quest also has a fucking fetish for the stones of time you can make appear, disappear, or transport to a different place by playing the Song of Time. I've never been sure why the developers put these things in, even in the original. After playing the Song of Time once, you know exactly what to do every time you come across stones of time or a green navi that indicates an invisible one is near. There is zero thought process behind them anymore for the player on repeated appearances, and all they end up achieving is breaking up the pace. In Master Quest, it's all the worse because the dungeons are littered with stones of time. Regardless, this version of the game is definitely worth checking out if you're a big Ocarina of Time and or Zelda nut. I couldn't tell you for certain whether it's truly harder or not because I've completed the original heaps and heaps more, so I automatically perceive Master Quest as more difficult, but it was at the very least something different and refreshing to tackle that managed to get me stuck on a handful of dungeons a few years back on the 3DS remake, and once again when recording footage for this review. Speaking of the 3DS remake, the Master Quest portion there also mirrors the world similarly to Twilight Princess on the GameCube and Wii, and has Link losing twice the health when damaged. Enemies come in larger quantities and are more threatening in general in Master Quest 2 in both the GameCube and 3DS versions, which actually led to a few game overs early on in the game for me. I haven't seen that screen for the longest time in the original game, so that's saying something, I guess. This brings us to the last component of Ocarina of Time, the combat. Whenever you're up against small enemies like bats and spiders and the like, there's nothing much to say or criticize. They are more annoyances and there to sip health away, but fighting them is a quick and superficial yet rewarding job via rupees, hearts, or ammunition to stock up. We're getting a bit more intricate up in this son of a bitch when it comes to opponents that compare to you in terms of man statue, I guess, since they all have more developed strategies and transform an encounter with you into a real battle. A very common criticism amongst gamers nowadays is that the combat in Ocarina of Time only contains the illusion of difficulty with all the waiting. I'd say I half agree, half disagree with that. It is very true that many enemies here walk around you and can only be damaged when they open up. The fact that so many opponents dictate the pacing of the battle may be tiring and tedious to you, and encounters with new monsters or bad guys you haven't run into before most likely require a similar tactic to beat. Combat can come across as formulated and predictable, making it a snooze fest you'd rather not put up with. And to be frank, there were times I found myself mindlessly sword spinning more than I'd like to admit. One sprinting to get some enemy or a group of enemies done and over with so I can move the hell on. Sometimes that ended up working flawlessly too, believe it or not. However, it's not all bad. For one thing, by messing around with the various tools available to you, you'll be able to one-hit KO or stun different types of foes with specific items/weapons. Sometimes the environment and geometry around you affect the way you deal with opponents too. A good example is the Sacred Forest Meadow, which is crowded by these huge guards in tight corridors, which can only be killed off from behind and charge you into a pool of water further back when they notice you. A handful of dudes also have to be taken on with care and caution, no matter the circumstances. Style foes are pretty aggressive and their attack patterns are RNG based, while the Iron Knuckles have such ridiculous damage output that you could be dead with merely 2 or 3 connected hits. I won't deny that the combat can be monotonous and bland at times, but I also gotta give credit where credit is due and say some scenarios and sections are pretty engrossing, well worth the time and effort in my opinion. Especially in the Master Quest edition, which bombards you far more with strong enemies. I was legitimately challenged at times and experienced quite a few game overs, as I've said. I do have to add that the elements of growth the Zelda titles can make or break the combat here. The more hearts, potions, and or fairies you happen to have, the more a player is going to lean towards being careless and sloppy in battle. This just seems to be an inherent quirk for whenever RPG-like tropes are included in a game. If the main quest was so difficult and punishing that you practically need to complete side quests just to stand a chance, that would be frustrating for a lot of players. On the other hand, if the difficulty was dynamically amped up as you yourself become more powerful and flashed out, that would substantially devalue the purpose of much of the optional content in the game. What's great about this though is that there is a choice for players on how they want to play the game, which enhances replay value by default. Just don't expect to be captivated by any fights if you're the type who amasses everything ASAP, because Ocarina of Time then creeps up the Symphony of the Night levels of brokenness. Nowhere else is this felt better than with the main bosses. These are all big and menacing, and if you've solely been tackling the main quest, you can be in for some tough battles. Granted, none of them come even close to the difficulty level of something like 7 Force in Gunstar Heroes, but this is not a run and gun game, so it also wouldn't be very appropriate. That said, while the monsters young Link faces are, to put it bluntly, pushovers, the ones adult Link has to put up with are fairly challenging. My favorite boss is undoubtedly Phantom Ganon from the Forest Temple, which consists of 2 phases. Phase 1 has a fake copy and the real boss traveling through paintings circling around the entire room, where players have to shoot down the real version before it attacks them, and Phase 2 is an adrenaline-filled match of energy tennis, as some Comic Johnny described it. Both are a good test of one's anticipation and reflexes. Truly, Phantom Ganon is a pleasure to face, and so are most other bosses for that matter. But only if you haven't gotten extra hearts and bottles with fairies or potions. Otherwise, you won't be shaking 2 shits at them. As such, I wish the bosses didn't have the obvious weaknesses to weapons that they do. Got a boomerang inside Jabu Jabu's belly? Use it on Baronade, the boss of said dungeon. Got a mirror shield in the Spirit Temple? Use it to reflect the stuff these old witchy chicks fire at you. Every 3D Zelda game I can directly think of is guilty of this, and it's a series convention that really ought to be broken more often, at least in my opinion. Sure, there are 2 exceptions to this rule in Ocarina of Time, one of them being Bongo Bongo from the Shadow Temple, who is stunned by an item from an earlier dungeon, but they're just that. Exceptions. Had the bosses been less predictable and harder to figure out, they would have 1. Been more satisfying to fight in the first place due to an extra layer of complexity, and 2. Remained at least somewhat challenging when players come in all upgraded and well prepared with a bunch of health insurance. To give credit where credit is due again, the atmosphere for many of the encounters is spot on though, and they are memorable experiences based solely on that feature. Very few of them feel cheap cheap on top of that, thanks to well-telegraphed attacks and patterns, which is a praise I cannot muster for the Shadow Link mini-boss. Don't quote me on this, but I'm guessing the game reads your inputs when fighting this prick, because he performs the same actions you do one for one. My attempts at having a legitimate sword fight with him have never been successful once. Your best option is to kill Shadow Link off by spamming the Megaton Hammer or Din's Fire, which utterly flips the coin in your favor. That's bad design, and many of the mini-bosses in general are rather lousy actually. Whether it's the ghosts from the Forest Temple or the flare dancers from the Fire Temple, where so much of your time spent is waiting around for them to do their thing, I feel they highlight the aforementioned gripes people have with the combat the most. True, the main bosses also demand the player to wait quite a fair amount, but many mini-bosses barely do anything threatening in the meantime or afterwards. You just assault them when they finally open up, and that's it. There's very little substance underneath all the waiting. The worst is when the game rehashes some of these mini-bosses with the most insignificant alterations, if any at all. There is no excuse for something like that, and it's padding in its purest form. We now segue into the single most objective flaw I can point out in Ocarina of Time: the sluggish pacing. The main culprits are definitely the unskippable cutscenes with awful text scrolling, and how every time I have to play an Ocarina song for something, I have to sit through a tune and a cutscene or two. A massive pain in the rear in Master Quest with all the stupid stones of time everywhere. There is the time traveling, as I pointed out before as well, where you have to watch a cutscene of Link putting back or pulling out the Master Sword, and then there's probably 2 more cutscenes around the corner to warp back to where you want to be. It's sometimes said all of this may act as hidden load times, but I don't buy it. There is no reason why the Temple of Time would have to be fully reloaded whatsoever when going from young Link to adult Link or vice versa, and new areas are read and transferred in about a second when entering them. There are also Navi and Kepora Gebora, who love to interrupt you from time to time throughout your playthrough with advice, and while they have a place for Ocarina of Time newbies, I wish there was an option to shut them up completely. Yes, Navi, I can figure out myself how to open a goddamn door. Yo, go away and leave me be. Christ. I'm probably forgetting other annoyances I've had as well, and I don't mean to suggest that these individual details alone have any feasible impact, I really don't. But when you mix them all together, you'll realize there's a lot of your time outright wasted while it didn't need to be that way. There's the argument that some of these details benefit the realism, like slow climbing up on ladders and vines, and I can understand that argument, but that doesn't lessen the pain when they have to solve a puzzle with lots of pushing big blocks around. The pacing of Ocarina of Time is a definite flaw, one that I know for sure can be off-putting to certain types of players. The 3DS remaster attempts to address this via faster scrolling text, a more efficient UI via the touchscreen and other tweaks, but it doesn't fully resolve the problem. The only cause of the overall slow feeling of the game that you cannot really accuse it of is the fact the engine runs at 20 frames per second. Not 30, 20. For Nintendo 64 standards, that's nothing out of the ordinary, but in 2016, that's certainly a bit jarring. Be that as it may, I think 20 FPS was a wise decision on Nintendo's part. Ocarina of Time is not a game that needs a high frame rate, and by locking it to a lower value, they could squeeze more graphical fidelity out of the hardware. It's still not the most advanced game on the system, but the animations are smooth, well as smooth as 20 FPS can get. The cinematic shots are all well done, the character and environmental modeling is great, the weather effects add a cool layer of detail, and the real-time day and night system helps immersing the player more into the virtual world. The textures overall didn't appear as blurry as I remembered them, but there's still a fair share amount of them that really stick out like a sore thumb, and the pre-rendered 2D environments show an awful lot of compression these days on high-def televisions with clean video signals. originals. Back then, walking around in pre-rendered images was revolutionary. The PlayStation 1 Final Fantasy games did it too. But the irony is that these sections hold up the most poorly now. Inevitably, the graphics are the most dated aspect of Ocarina of Time, but the main point should be, during its initial release, this was a mighty fine looking game, especially if you bear its scope in mind. I don't own a 3DS capture card, so I cannot show off the enhanced visuals in that version, but it really does look more appealing, and the frame rate was also up to 30 FPS, which magically gives the whole experience a swifter feel to it. The audio category has thankfully stood the test of time significantly better. The sound design is still really solid, and believe it or not, Ocarina of Time has support for surround sound. I cannot speak on how well it was implemented since I do not own a surround set, but for 1998, such a feature is way ahead of its time. Even in stereo though, the game did an outstanding job of making me aware of my surroundings purely through audio, and the overall attention to detail is sublime. All the sound effects are crisp and effective, and I love the interactive touches of the soundtrack. Most notable is Hyrule Field's music, which actively changes depending on the time of day and the predicaments around Link. Also, whenever you're nearing an enemy anywhere in the game, the current song and the battle song dynamically fade out and in, respectively. Some of the songs in this game are also really thematic and tied to certain events or characters, most effective of which probably being Ganondorf's theme whenever he's hit or is about to hit the scene. Whenever you hear those first few notes, you know exactly what's up. And again, in terms of interactive music, in the final dungeon, Ganon's Tower, you can hear Ganondorf playing his own theme live. And the further you climb up, the louder the instruments get as well. Finally, Koji Kondo just nailed the whole score when it comes to supporting the game's visuals and world and writing memorable pieces. I especially dig the clearly defined contrast between the atmospheric ambient sounds of the dungeons and caves, and then the cheery / relaxed and hummable nature of the tunes in towns and cities such as Lon Lon Ranch and Kakariko Village. It is true that from a technical standpoint, the audio chip inside the N64 is capable of a whole lot more. Ocarina of Time samples are fairly unimpressive and very general MIDI sounding, but when the compositions themselves are there and totally enhance the experience, it's done its most important duty successfully. And that, my friends, is the end of my The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time review. Putting the game under a microscope now in 2016, around 17 years after its debut, what conclusion do I draw from my playthroughs? I would say virtually everything Ocarina of Time does has been done better since, either by following sequels or different games and franchises altogether. From the world itself to the combat to the puzzles, Ocarina of Time is one of the granddaddies of 3D 3D adventure titles, a sort that held a lot of potential to grow and evolve. But we shouldn't forget where numerous newer games would proceed to take inspiration and ideas from. One of the things I believe made Ocarina of Time the juggernaut it has become is how it handled the transition from 2D to 3D. It's probably one of the smoothest I have personally witnessed. Sure, not everything was perfectly executed and implemented, but going back to this game feels far less jarring than it should when it comes to the controls and mechanics. And for the series' first title in 3D, that's a remarkable achievement. Yet, it doesn't stop there. While true, nearly all of its components have been improved and expanded upon exponentially by Nintendo and other developers, Ocarina of Time was a fully realized, cohesive, and immersive journey in 3D. One of the most epic ones at that. The icing on the cake was the butt ton of content packed in, and even though not all of that content is as interesting and impressive anymore, the amount of it was very impressive back then regardless. With all that being said, while I do believe Ocarina of Time deserves a lot of the respect, praise, and recognition it has gotten, I do also think the status it's held and still holds for some of the best game of all time has created highly unrealistic expectations for those who have never played the game and want to have a go at it in this day and age. It has flaws, it's always had them from day one, and I would say the game has been outdone as I stated earlier. Regardless, Ocarina of Time holds such a very special place in my heart, and I'd say it remains a worthwhile experience that stood the test of time pretty well in a healthy amount of its aspects. However, as a newcomer to this legendary Zelda installment, you're better off not expecting to be blown away by it. Either way, this is the game you want to start out with in case you want to get into 3D Zeldas, and if you own a 3DS, the port/remake for that is what I would recommend, seeing how it has some tweaks and changes that make for an updated and more modernized experience.